Let's see, who have we got? We've got Brent's on, Krishna's on, Bart's on, Galen's here, Jeremy. We got Diane, we got Jason in the room. Well, Jeremy's in the room here too. Taylor, you're on.
I'm here. My headset's on. No nature noises.
Who didn't I mention? So Jeff will not be able to join us today. He's got a dentist appointment, and Julie is out. So I think that's everybody. So normally with these, we kind of go around and do a status update, but there were a number of questions that had come up about basically the source control repository that Jeff had been working on, and Taylor had been doing some research on this. And rather than hear me blab for the next 30 minutes or going around, I think what would be the best use of our time here is Taylor's got some information that I think he's going to share with us. So I'll just kind of kick it right over to him. We are recording this so that Jeff can go back and take a look at it. That way, Julie gets back and she needs to look at this. So ask really good questions. And Taylor, I'll kick it over to you.
Sounds good. And I want this to be a collaborative discussion. A lot of this is kind of flexible. There's really no formal process around Logic Apps DevOps. A lot of other components in Azure have things like deployment slots or like set up specific continuous integration, continuous deployment templates. Logic Apps it falls into a strange gray zone with in the Azure stack. So nothing we see here is, I would say, a for sure solidified process, but I think it's a good start to get us going and get people developing. And I have a little bit of a small presentation, nothing great, nothing big formal, but really our goal is to discuss and demonstrate a developer workflow that facilitates CI/CD for Logic Apps. So basically what a developer is going to get into Visual Studio and do, to develop and deploy a Logic app. So if I'm going to go ahead and pull up my script, but we'll start out with, and then we're also going to start talking about understanding connection management for consumption Logic apps. So this is kind of the biggest hurdle in development and deployment of Logic apps across resource groups. In my research and my understanding, this is kind of this is the big speed bump, especially with deployment. So I don't have any sort of continuous deployment, just so you know, set up. I'm waiting on some RSM permissions, slow moving, big company. They don't want to come right at me, I guess. But I do have some of the pre-steps set up within Visual Studio. We can see how that works. And as always, if there are questions, comments, concerns, I can note those down. We can have takeaways, and I can continue to just so everyone here knows, we have some interns who joined our call last week. They're not here this week, but next week I have a meeting with one of our business application development directors, who he is responsible for the CE platform, but he does a lot of DevOps work. And so we are actually assigning our interns to develop a formal process for DevOps for Logic apps. So eventually we will have our own formal process that we can also demonstrate. We're not sure what that looks like yet, but it is going to be largely based on what I show you here for developing and deploying those Logic apps. Without further ado, any questions? Sounds good. I really want to start out with showing how you develop Logic apps in Visual Studio. So as of right now, I believe everybody is currently developing via the portal, correct?
Yes.
Except for maybe Jeff. So what I'm going to show you here is kind of, like I said, the developer workflow within Visual Studio. So I'm going to do is close my current instance of Visual Studio, reopen it. And actually, I want to open up my Azure subscription. And I'm going to create a quick example in, I'll just use the one I have here. So I have an existing Logic app built in my development resource group. So this is one that was built through the portal. So I really do want to show you how you can pull these down. So even if you start developing in the portal, you can continue developing in Visual Studio. So it's great for setting up templates or just, hey, I want to get one started. I don't have Visual Studio. You can continue that development in Visual Studio, which is great. So we start with our Visual Studio, new project. So I believe a lot of these things are going to be pre-set up for everybody. They're not going to have to go get extensions, things like that. So you'll create a new project. I have my recent project templates, but what we're looking for is Azure Resource Group. So this is basically, it's the same as a resource group within Azure. It's just a bucket of components that you can use to, it's a bucket, it's a resource, but it's also a bucket for other resources, if we haven't talked about that before. So I'll go ahead and create it. I'm going to create this, and it's just going to exist in my client source folder. It's where I keep all my code and all my clients. I'll click create. So what happens here is you actually get templates for Azure. And one of those templates is a Logic app. So it creates an empty Logic app that can be used to define workflows. Great. I click OK. Load my other window, 1 second. So what we have here is Visual Studio. I mean, yours might not look exactly like this, but this is just how mine's set up. So on the right, we have our solution. So we have a PowerShell file. Didn't need to open that, but this is another method used to deploy. We're kind of researching the PowerShell component of this. I don't know that it's 100% necessary. So right now we can ignore it. Then we have our actual ARM template. So this is the meat of the Logic app. This is how you deploy it to other environments. This is where the actual definition of the Logic app exists. So as you can see down here, we have resources section, and this is where the actual logic goes. And then we have our parameters, which is used to parameterize specific parts, components within Logic apps. So for example, if you needed to switch a attribute in a query in like a SQL connector, that's where you would, depending on environment, so like from dev to test to prod, that's how you would do that. I don't have a demonstration of parameterizing pieces right now. That's kind of my next step, is working to show parameterization. Right now, just develop our workflow. So as you can see, we have this nasty JSON that most likely we're not going to be working with. The nice thing is, what we can do is right-click our Logic app.json, and you can actually open with the Logic App Designer. So what's going to happen is you'll get this Logic App properties, and it will say, okay, what's your subscription? So this will be tied to your user. It's access via Azure, and then your resource group as well. So if you're working in the dev resource group, you start in dev, so on and so forth. Most likely you'll only be working in the dev, maybe dev and test. I can't imagine you'll technically have access to prod. So you'll be working with your dev group, and I'm going to select my location, and I want it in the resource group, in the same location as the resource group. I'll click OK. So we get something that's pretty similar to the portal. It's actually the kind of the same screen you get when you create a new Logic app in the portal. And what I'll do is I'll just create, and sometimes I get these errors, but just continue running and it works fine. So I'll start out with a simple Logic app. I'm actually going to send myself an email. Not really, but that's what it'll look like. So the reason it's making me sign in and create a connection is because this isn't technically linked to that. It doesn't have an existing connection to pull from. But there are some things I will show you to facilitate that. And then we'll talk about connections later because they're a little bit of a headache. Information in there. So what we have done here is essentially create a logic app. Now, this has not been deployed to Azure yet. This is currently only exists on the local machine. But what I'd also like to show you is pulling down an existing logic app into Visual Studio. So you've created a new one. You want to add another one. How do we do that? So on this left-hand bar, we have this Cloud Explorer. And you can see that we have our Azure subscriptions here. You might have seen my Visual Studio Professional subscription pop up. And you can see all of the different groupings that are available within Visual Studio. So these are the type of resources you can develop upon. For example, we have our logic apps. And here are my logic apps associated with my subscription. So what I would like to do is I'm going to open with the logic app editor. And look at that. We have our other logic app that I built, pretty similar, as a terminate step, so it's canceled. Now, again, this is still, you don't have this fully downloaded. This is just a representation of what's online. You can see this little download button right here. I'm going to download it. And then I'm actually going to take this to my Azure Resource Group 2. And I'm going to name this It is added to the folder, but at this point, you still need to add it to the project that you're working on. So we're going to add it. We're going to add existing item. And then it should be right here. Did it get saved to the right spot?
He was one level up.
Ah, there. That's my mistake. Thank you.
I was going to ask why he was one level up to begin.
Not intentional.
Okay.
Just misclick. So I will go ahead and add this. So at this point, we have our logic app from online to access. So what I would like to show now is there's no parameters file yet. Again, pretty easy to add a parameters file, new item, and it even shows up. So Azure Resource Manager parameters file. I want to double check. So the recommendation is to have a parameter file per tier right now. That's something we're still working through, trying to understand what the best practice is around managing parameters files, whether it's going to be on the developer or it's going to be within DevOps. For right now, I'm just showing the creation of it. So we have our logic app, and we can open it with the logic app designer. It's going to ask us our resource group, so dev, and there it is. Back to it. So that is the general workflow of creating new and adding. Now, I will be showing the source controlling next, like adding it to source control, showing it in source control, kind of what you do from there. This is not a final process again, so there's some things to be fleshed out, but this is kind of what it looks like to be developing these in Logic in Visual Studio. Quick questions, comments, concerns?
I think so.
I know there'll be questions as it comes up and as things actually begin working. That's when we start finding a lot of things, but hopefully we can address some of those concerns along the way. So at this point, I'm going to actually switch to my other file. my other project. Reason being, I already have it source controlled. Naming was a little off. So at this point, I have my I have an existing project, and I have to imagine that your scenario here is going to be this resource group is going to be the entirety of the development logic apps. This will be everything. You'll have all your logic apps in here, organized kind of by name. So like it'd be example one. That's one logic app, and then it'll have a parameter file for each of its tiers along with it. There's discussions around foldering them. That's the part that I don't know how DevOps pipelines can handle it yet. That's what I'm working on. This structure was found. I found this on Stack Overflow. So basically, we're trying to deploy multiple ARM templates for logic apps. We want to dynamically select these templates at runtime using pipelines. So this, I think, fits that model the best. Otherwise, we're going to have a logic app per we're going to have a logic app separately and deploy them separately and have their own repositories. I don't think that's conducive to development or management. I think that's a lot more difficult. I think something like this, where we're organizing our logic apps with kind of a similar structure: project name, logic app name.json, project name, logic app name, parameter.json, and then with a dev, probably a .dev in here as well to organize that. And that way, we'll be able to almost kind of loop through the logic apps within the repository and deploy them as they're updated. So a lot of this depends on the actual branching and then merging structure. Everything I've read in source controlling these is that merging them is sort of merging JSON with Git is sort of difficult. I've used some other tools. So we have the development background that I have in Business Central. We actually don't have a good way to merge either. We don't have a good branching strategy. We usually do a dev test prod, and then what we do is we use a tool called WinMerge. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it, but basically what you do is you copy down your you create a folder, you copy your like master branch or your main branch into one folder. You copy down your prod branch or your development, your test branch into another folder, and then you merge them, and then you deploy into the like test repository. So essentially, you're manually synchronizing them. You're doing the merging. Now, there might be other ways to do that within DevOps of merging across those dev and test, but that's just one example of how you would manage that. Is you'd merge any changes from dev to test, and at that point, test would have changes. And maybe you only change one logic app, which is kind of good. So that's like a good example is you're going to merge changes from one logic app. And then at that point, the DevOps pipelines would take those changed logic apps and our to be determined folder structure, and then it would deploy those. So I think that's going to be a similar strategy. And if we can automate that merging better, that's better through branching. But that's something to be evaluated still. And I will pull up my DevOps actually. Find it. So this is essentially what it looks like. We have a resource group folder, and then these are our Azure solutions, or our Visual Studio solutions. So this is actually what allows you to open it in Visual Studio, which is important, but these are the actual files in here. These are the ARM templates and the parameter files that go along with it. So it would be in here. Again, I think there might be a hierarchy of folders in the future just to facilitate branching potentially. But that, again, remains to be seen when I can actually get access to deploy in Azure pipelines. So that's a lot. And a lot of this is for recording purposes as well, so that we have a sort of base process to look at and review and potentially work from in the future. Any questions?
For your merging going from branches, I assume it's just a named folder. Why couldn't you just do a file diff and move the diff files that you wanted up to branches?
Yeah, and that's possible. Any sort of merging strategy. I just know that I know there's things that have issues with merging JSON files from my reading and my understanding. I have not tried to merge them yet because I haven't had a situation where I actually needed a dev test prod. Typically, I've built logic apps along, and I've usually copied, and created like a dev test prod logic app within one resource group because a lot of my projects have been single logic apps, not multiple groupings of logic apps. So I agree. If you can do find difference and just merge those branches, that's great. And even if everybody can have their own branch, which is technically how development is supposed to be accommodated, is everyone makes their own branch, and then you merge that branch back into the main branch as you develop and change it. And then at that point, then you can merge it over to test, I believe. So that's kind of the life cycle of it. But again, there's other ways to facilitate that merging. And I'm going to add a takeaway of that is just merging in general. And again, this is very rudimentary, I would say, starting process, but this is the general process I've seen kind of replicated at this point across a lot of other people's development. The big question mark still is the actual pipeline actions and what happens there. It is the dev ops portion, not the developer portion. I think this is pretty well solidified online, and this is how you do it. There might be different ways of, again, naming conventions, things like that we can use in folder structures. And then there are some discussions around parameters. Like there's a necessity to sort of delete connection parameters, which aren't not too difficult, I think. But I think we're going to save that for right now. I think I'd rather talk about connections in the time we have left, which are kind of a bugaboo. So I will. Any other questions? I don't want to skip anybody. Okay, so I want to talk about connections. So as we know, connections are the actual connection to an application, a database, a file location, anything that Logic Apps connects to actually, here's one right here, that a Logic App uses to connect into a service or application. So here I have an API connection, Office 365. It is a resource. However, here's the fun part of connections. You can't create them via the portal. They're not in something like a Logic App where you can go actually create it. You create it via a Logic App or via an ARM template. I actually did that. I took this Office 365 connection, I exported the template, and I downloaded it, and then I redeployed it to test, to have it in test. So that's the way to generally create connections across environments. But I actually want to talk about what the overarching goal of connections is and how to use them and how to manage them. It's a little different than Logic Apps, and I think it's going to be tougher to do it via CI/CD based on what I've been reading. So connections are typically environment specific. So you have a dev, a test, a prod. That makes sense, right? I think you typically have a different SQL servers that you use. One of the big things is that really, if you're doing secure development, is only a few people will know the connection details, right? You're not going to give everybody the production or the test or even the dev credentials for a specific application. Maybe hopefully we're using service accounts. Not that maybe some people do know this connection details. But again, I think the best practice is that only a few people know the details. Connections live at the resource group level, as we saw. So if you're deploying a Logic App to a new resource group, you need a new connection. Now, that connection might already be established there, but it still needs a new connection there. OAuth connections and most connections in general need to be re-authenticated in the portal. So when you deploy from dev to test for the first time, when you go into a Logic app, you'll need to authenticate that connection because of the OAuth process. So you'll go in, you'll click, it'll say like invalid connection on an action. It tells you, it'll say have a big yellow triangle. It's a invalid connection. You'll click the action, you'll click the connection, and it'll re-authenticate. Kind of bulky, but that's how OAuth works. So the best thing I saw was that connections are like setting up a user in Active Directory. Someone should create a connection once in an environment per environment. So my Office 365 connection, we're going to have one of those typically, and then we're going to have another one in one in dev, and then we're going to go create another one in test. So basically one connection managed by somebody using ARM templates, and maybe this might be where PowerShell comes into play, or even see if we can do it during DevOps deployments of creating connections. But most likely PowerShell for this portion, because we're going to have to pull down those connections from dev and move them to test and then re-authenticate or change them out. And then so when a Logic app is deployed to an environment for the first time, so I've created a new Logic app in development. I'm going to move it to test. We want to move it to test. So this is when we have to manually authenticate. Again, it's similar. You go into the Logic app, it'll have a yellow triangle, you authenticate. But once a connection is set up once, we're going to have our future deployments of that Logic app will continue to utilize that connection. So you'll never have to authenticate it again. So that's kind of the bulky part of it. Hopefully, once you've got it deployed once, the continuous deployment will take care of everything else. But the first time a Logic app's being created, there will be some setup. There will be some manual intervention required. That's kind of the gist of connections. Like I said, they are kind of a pain to deal with when it comes to consumption Logic apps. And I'm still looking for some better ways to kind of manage those. But right now, manually adding them seems like the best way. But the benefit is that you can utilize those connections across other Logic apps. They're not tied to a specific Logic app. They are a unique individual Logic resource within the resource group that you can then you can use other Logic apps can then point to it. So it's kind of a shared resource among those Logic apps. That's a big one. Any questions generally about connections?
I have a question on
Yes.
the authentication. So if, for instance, something with the API password gets changed, so somebody would have to go out and manually re-authenticate that connection with the new credentials.
Correct. That is the case.
And then any Logic apps that use that connection, would those need to be re-authenticated as well, or would they just pull off that main connection authentication?
I believe that they should just pull off that main authentication, but I will take a note on that and verify. I believe that when you update a connection in Logic apps, like an API connection, you can do it at that resource level, and then it should propagate down. But I want to verify that. So propagate. But great question. The benefit of this model, though, is that a developer does not have to manage the connections to them. They might have to delete some parameters around the connections so that they connect up when they're doing development. But hopefully, we are doing it in a model where everyone's pulling down from a repository, and then they are simply able to add connections from there, and then we'll modify the parameters, and then it can be deployed to dev, and it will connect up from there. Once we have a full workflow of, hey, this is an existing repository of your Logic apps, go pull it down, add a new Logic app, develop here, and then redeploy or push to push the repository and then deploy at that point, then where we can probably see the entire workflow, and then we can see some of those administrative tasks around connections.
What remaining questions do we have? I'm just kind of watching our time here a little bit. We're kind of over already, so I do apologize and appreciate everybody hanging on here. What other questions do you have for Taylor here?
I don't have any right now, but I'm sure I will.
Yes, I think we're definitely going to have some questions along the way, and there's going to be some Delta Dental specific processes that get included and altered here. This is again just the base process that I've seen everybody use online to start developing in Visual Studio. From there, I think there's going to be some a unique DevOps process that Delta Dental utilizes to facilitate all of this.
All right, well, I appreciate everybody's time again. Just so you know, we don't have anything on the calendar yet for July and going forward on these work groups. I'm kind of putting out my feelers to find out if we need to maybe keep these on a weekly basis, if we need to maybe go every other week, maybe go a little bit longer in our time since we seem to burn up our half hour very, very quickly. But if anybody has any preferences, if certain days work better, please let me know as well. If Thursday is not a good day and you'd like to see these maybe on a, Monday, Tuesday, earlier in the week, or on Fridays, God forbid, let me know and I'll get those set up. And then with our next meeting, we'll kind of go around and get where everybody's at status wise. I think at that point, we'll also get kind of an update on where the Visual Studio licenses are. So I think those are moving forward. We've got a ticket out there for Encodium. We mentioned that before. That's a product we're going to probably be bringing on. And then, yeah, we're going to address some additional roadblocks. But if you have some, don't hold on to them until we meet again. Shoot those over to Jeff or Jason. And then we want to get those looked at right away. And then we'll also look at how we're going to utilize whether Taylor will be in all of these meetings or if we'll just start being a little bit more surgical and how we get our questions over to them and not, do the shotgun blast where it includes everybody. So we just want to be, again, aware of everybody's time. So that said, any last comments or are we good to get ready to start our weekend here pretty soon?
Mine starts tomorrow. RSM has a 4-day weekend. Nice luxury.
Are we good? Everybody's quiet. We're ready for lunch.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good holiday.
Thanks.
Have a
Have a
good
good
Fourth.
weekend.
Thank you. Bye.